together, Job says, but more importantly, the most godly man on the face of the earth. As Satan makes his required report before God, God himself challenges Satan with this godly man, Job. And Satan says, well, Job only serves God for what God gives him. And he claims that if God allows him to take everything from Job, that, well, he'll curse you to your face. The Lord gives Satan permission to touch everything except his life. Well, in one day's time, Job loses all of his wealth that he'd worked all of his life for. And as the crushing and deepest blow, loses all 10 of his children. All in one fell swoop. He blesses God for it, worships God, recognizes God gives and God takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And she's not a support and a helper for him. She tells him, just curse God and die. Get it over with. But Job retains his integrity and his faithfulness to God. Well, shortly after that, 3 friends, miserable counselors, Job calls them, they show up. They sit absolutely astonished for 7 days without saying a word, complete dead silence because of the depth of Job's grief. And finally, after that 7 days has passed, one-on-one, they start in on him. Basically, they all have the same theme, that Job must be suffering all these terrible things because he sinned against the Lord. Because bad doesn't happen in this world unless you deserve it in some way or another. It's like a karma thing. That's basically what they were claiming. Well, they showed themselves to be devoid of true wisdom or help, and they just deepen Job's misery. Now, he defends himself. He defends his innocence. And we know that he wasn't suffering because of sin that he had committed. The Bible tells us that. He was suffering because Satan was attacking him. Well, he goes, unfortunately, from a simple defense to a more vigorous defense, really offense even, and ultimately to a very arrogant defense about how incredibly innocent he is. He goes too far. He claims to be too innocent. He starts to get angry at God. Accuses God of injustice, unfairness, of inequity. He questions God. Doubts God's goodness. Demands answers of God. Why would you allow this to happen? He goes through the course of the book into some very dark places, doesn't he? At certain times in his conversation, he just wants to end it all because he loses all hope and all sense that God was in control and was allowing these things to happen. As far as Job was concerned, God did not care about his miserable plight at all. He begins to demand many things of God, assuming that he had a right to make those demands of God. He starts to despair and talk about how the wicked are blessed while the righteous are just crushed and destroyed. Speech turns very selfish and very negative. In the Old Testament, there's another character, a man by the name of Asaph, who was a hymn writer, a psalm writer. You look at some of the psalms and you'll see his name in the inscription under the title of the psalm. He was the choir director in Jerusalem. He found himself in a similar thought process to Job. Now, he says wickedness is rewarded and godliness is punished. That's what it seemed like to Asaph. Life didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. Asaph says this in Psalm 73 and verse 16. Well, when I thought to know this, it was too painful for me. I'm trying to make sense of God's ways in his life because he was looking at it from the wrong perspective. It gave him a headache. It was painful for him. And then he says, until I went into the sanctuary of God. Then I understood. Coming face to face with God brings a to him. In our last study, this mysterious character Elihu appears out of nowhere. And he respectfully approaches these older men, Job and these three other friends. And he's respectful in his manner. We saw that. But then he makes it very plain that these three friends are fools and nothing more, because they had no wisdom, even though they claimed to be speaking for God. And he's angry with Job, it tells us, because Job has gone way too far in justifying himself rather than God. It's the statement that's made. Elihu had apparently, we could assume, looked up to Job. Maybe as a mentor, as a teacher, as a faithful man of God. Well, he's been disappointed now. And so Elihu speaks, it was for 6 or 7 chapters, the book of Job, and gives his response and gives some genuine wisdom. Job has no answer for Elihu. He begins to realize some truth and some wisdom is finally being delivered to him. God still hasn't spoken. He has a faithful servant who's speaking, but God still hasn't spoken. And for Job, maybe it was the silence of God that hurt the most. Why hasn't God said something? 37 chapters have gone by. In our reading, God has said nothing. Now, he's spoken to Satan, so he actually has said some things. That's in the opening couple of chapters, but Job knew absolutely nothing about that. He just knew that God had been silent towards him. Well, chapter 38, Job chapter 38 brings us at last to what looks like the answer that we've been looking for, and that Job's been looking for all through the course of this study. God is about to speak to Job. Silence is broken. Job's questions are about to be answered. So let's go to Job chapter 38. We're going to begin at the very beginning of the chapter, and we'll just see how far we read. Job chapter 38. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Who's he talking about? Who's he talking about? He's talking about Job. Who is this that dares to darken counsel, good counsel, with no knowledge at all? Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee an answer. A catastrophe that Job has gone through, like a shepherd would to a poor lost lamb. You might expect him to come and scoop Job up in his arms, so to speak, and whisper some words of reassurance and comfort and care to him. Now, you might expect God to behave as a father would behave on seeing one of his children fallen, crying, injured. His child's face is all crumpled up in pain, just longing for the love and the familiar touch and comfort from Dad. But a storm, that's how God appears. Twice we're told that God speaks to Job out of this storm cloud, out of a whirlwind, it says. That's a tornado. I mean, has anybody here ever been around a tornado? The roar, the noise, the catastrophic damage that's done. There's something about God that intimidates. Now, that's not all that there is to God, which is equally important to stress. God loves his children, we know, with a love that is indescribably strong and passionate. But folks, he is also holy, separate from sinners. And for now, that's what he wanted Job to understand. And that's the way that he appears to Job. In the first of God's speeches to Job, there are two main thoughts of equal and inseparable importance that I want to convey to you tonight. One truth has to do with God himself, and the other concerns Job, really mankind, we could say. And the first is this, and we'll read the chapter. God is far greater than we have conceived him to be. When I built the earth, this massive planet that we can hardly even fathom, whereupon are the foundations of the earth fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof? When the morning stars, that is the angels, sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Where were you, Job? Or who shut up the sea with doors when it brake forth as if it had issued out of the womb? That is probably have this phenomenal phenomenon, the tides and the gravitational pulls and everything. Well, the water doesn't come, flood over the continents. God set up the boundaries even for water that seeks its own level. God says, I'm the one that did that. And so I said, hitherto shalt thou come, but no further, and here shall thy proud waves be stayed. Hast thou commanded the morning since thy days, and caused the dayspring to know his place, that it might take hold of the ends of the earth, that the wicked might be shaken out of it? It is turned as clay to the seal, and they stand as a garment. And from the wicked their light is withholden, and the high arm shall be broken. Hast thou entered into the springs of the sea? That is the ocean currents. Hast thou walked in the search of the depth? Have the gates of death been opened unto thee? Or hast thou seen the doors of the shadow of death? No man can say that they've seen that and at least returned. Hast thou perceived the breadth of all the earth? Declare it, if thou knowest it all. Where is the way where light dwelleth? There's an amazing thing to think about. The light, the color spectrum, our puny eyes can see so little of it. And we have a few small inventions and tools where we can see the infrared or ultraviolet or some of the different extremes of the color spectrum. There's so much to it we don't even think about. It's incomprehensible to us. God says, hey, where's the way that light dwells? And as for darkness, where is the place thereof? That thou shouldest take it to the bound thereof, and that thou shouldest know the path to the house thereof. Knowest thou it because thou wast then born? Or because the number of thy days is so great? Hast thou entered into the treasures of the snow? Or hast thou seen the treasures of the hail, which I have reserved against the time of trouble, against the day of battle and war? By what way is the light parted, which scattereth the east wind upon the earth? Who hath divided a watercourse for the overflowing of waters, or a way for the lightning and the thunder, to cause it to rain upon the earth? We could just read on and on. God's just describing some of the amazing systems that he's built into the universe. And he's challenging Job and saying, hey, you have a little bit of knowledge about some of this stuff. Where were you when it was created? Where were you when I designed and developed all of these things? You can't even understand how it works, let alone understand how it was made. And so I'm going to stop there. We could read on, and there's 4 chapters, verses 38 through 41, where God continues on. And we'll talk about some of those thoughts in these greater points here. But I want to say, first of all, that God is far greater than we as people have conceived him to be. So many people today and throughout history have downsized God. Downsizing God has been a fashionable trend in society in favor of softness and permissiveness that coddles the human mind. God shrinkers abound. They're all around. Gird up now thy loins like a man, God says. The word translated gird, we get our word girdle from it, comes from a Hebrew word that referred to something that tightly encompassed or wrapped, such as a belt. The Hebrew word actually spoke or was commonly used to speak of wrestling, because of the way that the ancients would wrestle and try to wrap their opponents. And you see a lot of that same type of wrestling, the old-fashioned, the Greco-Roman type wrestling. Well, the wording is significant here. God says, gird up your loins like a man. Well, Job's been asking for a fight, hasn't he? He's been asking for a wrestling match with God. He's about to get it. And by the way, it's not a fight about physical strength. It's a fight about wisdom. The stage is set here. God will ask the questions. Job will answer. At least that's what God lays out to Job. Already we get the impression that this is really not a fight between equals, is it? You can see that very plainly from the very first verse in this chapter. The victor is obvious from the tone of those verses. Job has been demanding of God. And now God says, that's done. Stand up like a man. It's time to take it. Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. The hair on the back of my neck almost stands up as I read through that passage and read about God saying this to a man. What a fearful confrontation, huh? What's the first question? Job, you want a demand of me? Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. Job's been claiming to have deep understanding, deep enough to question and demand of God. God's question is devastating. The very first question, devastating to Job's arrogance. You can almost immediately sense Job reeling from it. God isn't finished. He just begun. There are more questions. Who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest, or who stretched the line upon it? More questions. Hast thou commanded the morning since thy days, and caused the day spring to know its place? Are you the one that keeps the sun coming up every single day, that it might take the hold of the ends of the earth, that the wicked might be shaken out of it? And more questions. Hast thou perceived the breadth of the earth? They didn't even know in those days whether the earth was round or flat. A lot of people thought it was flat. Declare if thou knowest it all. And more questions. He says in chapter 38, we didn't read quite this far, verses 31 through 33. Canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? He's talking about the constellations, the marvelous constellations that God's designed in the sky. Canst thou bring forth Mazzaroth in his season, or canst thou guide Arcturus with his sons? That's the bear. Knowest thou the ordinances of heaven? Canst thou set the domain thereof in the earth? And more questions in chapter 39 and verse 19. Hast thou given the horse strength? He's talking about the horse that was the mighty tank in battle in those days, the weapon of war. Hast thou clothed his neck with thunder? And more questions God asks. Doth the hawk fly by thy wisdom and stretch her wings toward the south? Doth the eagle mount up at thy command and make her nest on high? All these phenomenal things of nature that we observe and see and we don't think a whole lot of. God designed all that. You know, in these 4 chapters, chapters 38 through 41, there are 76 questions that God throws at Job. One after another, after another, after another, none of which he can answer. Only God's able to answer these questions. There are questions about the earth, about the sea, about the constellations, about the weather, about light and darkness, animals and birds. There are questions that delve into the specific atomic level design of the universe that God himself developed with ease. No big deal for God to build that, but impossible for man to even decipher. There are questions about the sustainment of the universe. What's the point? To underline that all these things testify of God. That God is great. No one can compare to him. Nothing can compare to him. He's greater than we can grasp. Look at what he knows in comparison with the little that we know. And you start to get the point of what God is saying here. He understands things with ease that we could never understand at all. God, the Bible tells us, dwells in unapproachable light. It says that in Psalm 97 and 1 Timothy chapter 6. He's so far above us, folks, that we cannot possibly understand him or his ways. We just can't. Don't be surprised that God's ways may be beyond your grasp. Job shouldn't have been surprised that some things were beyond his grasp, that he couldn't unravel it. God himself is beyond our grasp. what we understand of God, we understand because he has accommodated himself in some small way to our capacity. That's why we know anything about him at all. He's used baby talk to make himself known to us. He's used all through his word. He's used metaphors and illustrations, word pictures, to give substance to his form. So we speak of God anthropomorphically, like he has eyes and ears and hands and all these different body parts like we have, knowing all along that he has none of those things. Now that imagery is given for our shallow minds, so we can somehow quantify God, so we can somehow try to comprehend and understand a little bit about him. That's what God's allowed, just so we can understand him in some small, shallow way. Listen, God doesn't need to answer Job's questions and his demands. God's not going to be put on trial by his creation. Job needs to see that God is so great, that God is so awesome. His mind can't grasp God's mind. To expect otherwise is to try to shrink God down to our size. Can't be done. God will not be shrunk down to our size. He gives us tremendous grace. He gives us tremendous slack for whatever amazing reason he has. But in the end, God is almighty, folks, and we are his creatures. He makes several statements that dress this thought out for us. In chapter 40 and verse 9, he asks Job, "Hast thou an arm like God?" In 41 and verse 11, he says, "Whatsoever is under the heavens is mine." Man dares not even stir. He has allowed himself to think that he deserves an answer from God. It's a matter of his rights. And God has to be subservient somehow to his rights. God owes him. God's obligated to explain himself to Job. Job set himself up as judge. And he's entered a verdict against God. God is guilty. His actions aren't just. Well, Job's trying to bring God down to his level and demand of God. And Job is elevating himself to this position of demand upon God for justification for what God has dared to allow to come into his life. Now, Job doesn't have understanding of why his circumstances have happened. And frankly, I don't know that he ever got an explanation from God. I don't see it in the book of Job. We probably won't ever know either. Well, sometimes, with the benefit of gracious hindsight, we can see how God's hand worked in some way that we just didn't understand at the time we were going through a difficulty. Sometimes we're able to graciously see that after the fact. These are not our ways. You know these statements from the Scripture, nor are his thoughts our thoughts. As high as the heavens are above the earth, so much higher are his ways than our ways, and his thoughts than our thoughts. We have to grasp that we can't even begin to reach to that height of understanding God's ways. It just can't happen. The Bible tells us this statement in the New Testament: "Great is the mystery of godliness." God's ways are sometimes a mystery to our weak, finite minds. And this is not so much a problem even of sin, though sin has seriously affected our ability to understand anything that's spiritual, hasn't it? The problem is that we're just simply too small to understand the ways of God. We really are, when we boil it down. Well, God uses all kinds of contrasts through these chapters to draw the point out, including the magnificence of two of his greatest creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan. He talks about them in chapters 40 and 41. Again, a fascinating read. We don't have time to read through all that. I'm just going to give you a very brief description and try to help you wrap your mind around why God brings these creatures out. Almost all of chapter 40 is devoted to talking about this creature, Behemoth. All right? These two creatures, the most powerful. This should be interesting to everybody here if you like dinosaurs and studying about those things. the most powerful land and sea creatures respectively that God created. They could humble and they could terrify any man on the face of the earth. God talks about that. Man was powerless against them. Their might could not be overcome, and their armor could not be penetrated. Behemoth was made the equivalent of iron and brass. That's how God describes him. And God says this of Behemoth. He says, he is the chief of the ways of God. In chapter 40 and verse 19. Not man, by the way, but Behemoth was the chief of the ways of God. That was God's own words. He was so massive and unimaginable that he was capable of drinking an entire... He maketh the deep to boil like a pot. You ever seen a pot of boiling water that's boiling really rapidly? Just rolling, water's boiling. He says, hey, that's what Leviathan is like. If you wake him up in the sea, you better be afraid. And when the deep starts to boil, God says this, the mighty are afraid. By reasons of breakings, they purify themselves. All right. And so here you have the mighty sailors, the seafaring men. They're out on their ships going through the ocean, going through the sea. And here Leviathan, the water starts to boil, and they know that he's coming and he's just going to break and destroy their ship. And what does God say? The mighty, they purify themselves. In other words, they get right with God because they know that their end is coming. It's right around the corner. You know, the picture that God paints here, it's reminiscent to me of the mythological creatures like the Kraken that terrify all those who live near the sea. I wonder if maybe that wasn't just brought into mythology because it was actually a creature, maybe not quite how they depict it, but a creature that destroyed everything around. Well, these are actually creatures that God made. And man thinks that he's great. God tells Job, man is nothing compared to them, and they're just animals. Not only is man nothing compared to them, God goes on to talk about some of the seemingly simple yet remarkable things that he's created. Even inanimate objects, non-living objects, that show how insignificant man is and how unable he is to research even small matters in the presence of the high mountain glaciers, or in northern latitudes like Alaska where we live. God asked this question, hast thou entered into the treasures of the snow? Or hast thou seen the treasures of the hail? You know, we get pretty tired of snow by the end of winter, don't we? We're ready for it to melt away and be gone. You know, the treasure of knowledge that God speaks of here, it was built by God into nature that every snowflake would be formed unique from all others. Who knows how many countless trillions, quadrillions of snowflakes fall every year across our landscape here, and every one of them is unique. What an amazing treasure. What an amazing knowledge that God's built into that. The way that hail is designed and formed. And so he asks Job, hey, you're so great in your mind? Let's bring you down a notch or two. Do you even know how this works? You don't even know how it works. In chapter 38, verses 34 and 37, he says, canst thou lift up thy voice to the clouds, that abundance of water may cover thee? Who can number the clouds in wisdom? Or who can stay the bottles of heaven? You know, we rag on the meteorologists a lot, don't we? The weatherman. They never know what they're talking about, do they? Well, Job didn't either, all right? And God says, hey, guess what? I'm the one that designed the weather. Everybody wants to complain about it. You want to complain about a snowstorm or about the way the weather is, you probably just ought to direct your complaint towards God because he causes that. But God's telling Job, he's talking about the hydrologic cycle, the way that God developed that. So incredible, phenomenal as you think about it and the way that it works to purify the air and purify the water and keep the land clean. All those things. No person can order a cloud to move an inch to the left or to the right. No man can even accurately predict, let alone control the weather patterns and the hydrologic cycle. They operate by powers that are far beyond our ability to control. There's a lot of other contrasts that God uses throughout these 4 chapters. I can't go into it all because we're about out of time. But all these contrasts are given to show just how insignificant man really is. And so what God does here is to humble Job's pride. God even states that this is his purpose in what he's demanding of Job. Leviathan, he sums up by saying, Leviathan is the king of the children of pride. And he answers to God. God uses the imagery about how he puts a hook in Leviathan's nose and leads him around like a pet. God does that. Leviathan doesn't offer any resistance to God, but is completely submitted to the Lord. That's what God can do to the king of prideful mankind. Again, God says that if mankind is so terrified of Leviathan, who is able then to stand before me? God states in chapter 40 and verse 12 that he looks on everyone that is proud and brings him low. There are 2 important things to take away from what God is saying about the lowliness of man here. He can, on the one hand, with little to no effort, he can prick the balloon of pride, cause it to just vanish in an instant. On the other hand, recognizing how lowly we are and how great he is, folks, can energize our faith that is failing at times. Both of which Job needed, by the way. He needed his pride balloon popped and gone. But he needed to be re-energized as he looked up at God. Recognized how great God was and how lowly he was. When Isaiah wanted to encourage the failing faith of God's people, when they were facing opposition and they were facing exile, he said of God this, He sitteth upon the circle of the earth, and the inhabitants thereof are as grasshoppers compared to him. He bringeth the princes to nothing. He maketh the judges of the earth as vanity. That is the mighty men of the earth, the greatest. He makes them nothing. He shall also blow upon them, and they shall wither. And the whirlwind shall take them away as stubble. To whom then will ye liken me? Or shall I be equal, saith the Holy One? Lift up your eyes on high. And behold, who hath created these things, for that he is strong in power. That's what God says. To people whose faith is failing, it's flagging, it's fading away some, maybe due to difficult circumstances. God says, lift your eyes up to me. Recognize who you are in comparison with me, and get your eyes back up where it is. And so his point, think about how great the world really is. And yet everything in it dwarfs in comparison to the greatness of God. The world is his footstool. He sits secure above it, transcends it. I mean, think of the stars. Nothing can make you feel your smallness more than gazing at the stars on a dark night. In our galaxy alone, there is thought to be something in the vicinity of 100 million stars. And there are some estimated 100,000 million galaxies across the universe. Distances boggle the mind. When the light from the closest, the clearest star, not the closest star, but the clearest star that we can see, it's the North Star, Polaris. It takes 350 years just for light to travel from that star at 186,000 miles per second to reach where we're at. The light from that star that you'll see tonight began its journey to us in the 1660s. That's how insignificant we are. That's how small we are. And unless we grasp it, folks, our usefulness is completely lost. We have no usefulness for God until we've reached the point of quiet amazement of God and realization of our own humbleness, our own smallness before God Almighty in his knowledge and his wisdom, until our souls are still before him. God really just resists us, holds us at bay. It's a hard lesson. It's a hard lesson for Job. It's a hard lesson for all of us, the hardest lesson of all. But when it's mastered, then maturity and usefulness arrive in our lives. Now, I want to tell you, as I sum this up, that at the end of this confrontation, as God has shown how succinctly great and majestic and almighty he is, and how utterly low Job is compared to him, despite even the praise of God that he is a godly man. Job is completely humbled and utterly broken over his accusations, over his arrogance against his Maker, against God. And Job answered the Lord and said this in chapter 40 and verse 4, Behold, I am vile. I'm dirty. I'm defiled. That's what man is. What shall I answer thee? I have no right to even answer you. And then in chapter 42, the last words that Job says to God. After God completely sums up everything he has to say, Job says, I know that thou canst do everything, and that no thought can be withholden from thee. Who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? Remember, that was the accusation that God made to him. Who is this that hideth counsel without knowledge? And so Job reiterates that and rephrases it back to God. Who is it that hideth counsel without knowledge? I have uttered that which I understood not. Things too wonderful for me, which I knew not. Here, I've been quieted. He's been broken. He's been humbled. Now he can be useful.